the roots, the tubers, where the roots or the tubers are consumed, the shoots, stems, leaves, fruits, and flowers. And most of the time, these are annual plants. That would be your lettuces or beets or carrots and such. But also aromatic and medicinal foliage, seeds, and roots from both annual or perennial plants. And for example, this could be different kinds of herbs, or it could be lavender. Cut flowers or potted ornamental plants and bedding plants also come under the classification of horticulture crops or specialty crops. And they involve both annual and perennial plants. And then trees, shrubs, turf, and ornamental grasses that are propagated and that are cultivated in the nurseries to be used either in landscapes, and that could be commercial or residential landscapes, or for establishing fruit orchards or other crop production. So here you have a whole list of plants, some of which you may not have even thought about before, being horticulture crops. And then the production systems vary widely as well. You can grow all of these crops, well, some of them only in the open field when we're talking about fruit and nut orchards, of course. But then a lot of these smaller plants, they can be cultivated in greenhouses or a lot of different kind of structures, some that let in natural lights and some that don't let in natural lights, and are entirely powered essentially by the plants, by adding artificial light and entirely controlling the environment, such as temperature and relative humidity. And then some people, in addition to producing plants, they also may produce fish, and an example of that would be aquaponics. So when we're going, let's see, I'm trying to, so when we're looking at what somebody that works in urban horticulture would need to know in order to be successful in producing these crops, here are some of the plants, and here are some of the topics. And what you can see here is really mostly what relates to plant production. So people need to understand the plant biology, crop selection and scheduling, everything, of course, related to soil health and management, related to fertilizing, things such as cover crop and crop rotations. In container and field production, you also need to know about the different media. In greenhouse production, how to control the environment. Seasonal structures are even a little bit more tricky because you have to balance between what you have in the open field, but then you have some kind of protection, which can sometimes lead to elevated temperatures for the crop if the structure is not properly ventilated. And then in indoor production, you have to be very diligent about regulating the environmental controls. People need to know about irrigation systems and management, of course, pest management, because when there is a crop, maybe if you're growing it outside for the first or second year, if you haven't really cultivated, or if nobody has cultivated a crop that you're planning to sell in that spot for a number of years, maybe the pests don't find you right away, but eventually they will come. And so it's important to understand how to do this in a sustainable manner so that you don't end up having to deal with pest management issues. And keeping a crop healthy in this context is very important. So learning about the principles of sustainable production and management is really paramount to doing a good job in growing. And then understanding the climate and weather, especially if you're growing outdoors or only in partial protected plants. Well, then, of course, in addition to learning and knowing everything about the plants and the ones that you will be growing, you have to know about the economics. You have to know about your market and what does the market bear. I mean, you may be able to grow a beautiful tomato, but is it going to compete with something that your customers can get a lot cheaper? And exactly the same thing at a farmer's market, at a grocery store, or at some other kind of venue. So you have to be competitive. You have to understand the economics of production. You have to be diligent about record keeping, understanding your pricing, and then of course troubleshooting and fixing everything of the production system, especially if you're a small operator. Once you expand beyond the point where you yourself and maybe your family and friends can operate what you want to, your growing area, you may have to hire labor, and then you have to supervise the labor too. And of course, coordinating, getting all the supplies and deliveries. So in addition to the plant biology, there is a lot of other parts that need to be going and that need to be well thought out before you're starting your production. When it comes to crop selection, you need to think about what do you want to grow. And here are just a couple of examples, some raspberries, some plugs over here, so small plants that you would sell to other people. You can grow all kinds of different produce, and you can grow that in protected environments. You may grow it in the soil, you may grow it in a hydroponic unit, or you may grow it in pots. So there are a lot of different options. In the classes that are to follow, in terms of crop production, we'll be talking about a lot of different production systems, such as growing in the field that you can see here. There are onions and chard, and then you see a house that has been covered over here, a hoop house that has been covered with shade screen, because in the summertime, some of the crops, especially in the lower elevations of Arizona, will do a lot better being protected from the intense sun. So you would use a hoop house. Some of the crops can be grown in low tunnels. Those are much closer to the ground, and they are temporary just over the crop. And sometimes it's only necessary to protect them from some wildlife when they're very small. But of course, we also talk about greenhouse and indoor production. The type of production that you're choosing will also depend on what quality soil you have, because when you're growing in the ground, your mineral soil is your greatest resource, and you have to take very good care of it. When you're growing in containers, then you would use some kind of growing medium or organic substrate. Those are often peat moss-based, coconut coir-based. They can have, a lot of different other inert components that you would add depending on what different crops need in terms of water holding capacity. So how moist or how dry you have to grow them. Like cactus need a different kind of mix than you would have like for bedding plants, for growing annuals like petunias or pansies, or compared to larger trees that you may be growing in larger containers. Then you can also have the non-organic substrates such as rock wool or other kind, sometimes also organic substrates such as coconut coir that are used in hydroponics, which you see an example here on the right side. And that can be grown both in a greenhouse or it could be grown in a hoop house. So which type of production do you need for the crop that you're looking for? Well, for outdoors or field production, usually people grow lower value crops or crops that require large amounts of space. Just some examples are like potatoes, corn, melons, fruit and nut trees. You can't really grow those in protected environments, and usually what you can get when you're selling these crops would not justify having some kind of protection that costs you, of course, money, and you would have to pay money to build it. You need money then to pay it off, and you also need money then to replace it. So having high value crops is usually something that you would use for temporary structures or covers, such as hoop houses. The low tunnels, they are usually a lot less expensive, and but in general, they are also not used for row crops, for the agronomic crops, or for crops such as corn or something like that. So in the temporary structures, you would grow things like berries or flowers, especially cut flowers that may be less damaged than, and a lot of the produce like peppers and tomatoes or some kind of ornamental plants that you want to make sure that they come to market without any blemishes and in a very good condition. Greenhouse crops usually have to be a higher value crop, and often it is like your crops like tomatoes, peppers, seedlings, or transplants, and you can produce a lot of those in a relatively small space. And the same thing for indoor farming. Often you would have specialty crops such as mushrooms or green leafy vegetables, microgreens, that you would grow in these types of facilities. Especially mushrooms here in Arizona would be tricky to grow in a greenhouse because you have to have very specific temperatures and relative humidity for their systems.
Ursula, sorry for...
Yeah, sorry, your presentation went away.
How did that?
Reshare the screen.
Yeah, I just, okay, just a second. How is that now? Can you see it now?
Yep, all good.
Okay, I'm just expanding it. Is that good now?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So here's an example of what nursery production could look like. And I wanted to share that because for some of you, you may not even be aware of all the different crops that nursery growers are producing. So on the top left, you see some native plants that are produced, and they include grasses, forbs, and some small herbaceous perennials. In the top middle here, you see bedding plants that are grown in the greenhouse, and then you can see the flats of, you know, things like pansies and a lot of the flowering plants that you would get in the retail nurseries. They're being hardened off right there. Here in the middle, on the top right, you see flowers. Then we have in the middle row, we have trees that have been recently transplanted. In the center, we have citrus trees that are ready to go to an orchard. And then on the left, we have bedding plants and also hanging baskets that are taking advantage of the two layers that you have in this kind of a greenhouse. On the bottom left, you have large trees growing in boxes. So this is a typical wholesale nursery production. And then of course, cactus grow very well in Arizona. And field production of roses is also a major area of nursery production in Arizona. So lots of different options here, from outside container production, from small to large containers, to field production, and then to production in shade houses or unshaded greenhouses. You have to match the crop to the climate. And the reason is, especially when you're growing outside, you don't want to grow something that is very difficult to grow, because otherwise you spend a lot of effort and you may not have the types of crop yields that will make it profitable to grow something. So you want to essentially go with something that will grow well, has a lower production cost and a lower production risk. So therefore, it's important to understand what is the climate where you're planning to grow. So you want to not have only sort of the regional climate, but really once you get into production, you want to know, when does it start to freeze here? When does it start to get above 100? And also you want to know, is it even useful or profitable for me to think about having a hoop house? Because is it going to be useful to grow earlier or later in the season? And how will my produce then compete with somebody else who can maybe in a little different area of the state grow it less expensive? And so we always look for what are the environmental conditions and which crops will be best matched to those environmental conditions. And if you're investing in structures, you have to know the limits they need to operate in. We have some areas over here that are perpetually in very high winds. And if you're investing in a structure like a hoop house, you want to make sure you know that these particular structures will be able to withstand the sort of highest winds that you can expect. Not to say that a microburst will not happen, but you do want to make sure that your hoop house will be able to withstand high winds and your crops will not be destroyed. When we're looking at the basics of crop production, we'll be covering soil health and management. But of course, as I mentioned before, you have to know a lot about general crop management, which type of crop to use, when to grow it, the basics of pest management, so that you can manage insects, diseases, and weeds before they become a real threat to your crop. You need to know about irrigation management. Of course, your type and quality of water is very important. And then you manage things differently in containers compared to when you're growing in the soil. So it's a good idea to think about what cropping system do I want to go with, because it's very difficult to want to do it all, because you need different infrastructure for different types of growing. When you have a container nursery where you're growing up to those large tree boxes, you need very different things, structures and preparation of the soil compared to when you're growing vegetables in the ground. So when we're thinking about soils, this is just a little example about considerations in order to make sure that your soil will be as fertile and biologically active as possible. I know a lot of the beginning farmers are usually very interested to grow pesticide-free, grow sustainably, and also grow organically. Now, if you want to go organic into an organic certified production type of system, that has a lot of prerequisites and a lot of paperwork and things you need to become familiar with. So if that is something that you aspire to do, and again, this is something that we usually cover in production, it is good to learn about it, learn about what was the ground like and what was grown there before, and were pesticides used before, or has somebody already grown in this area without pesticides for many years, so that you would qualify for this type of production. But overall, when you're growing in the soil, you should really think about a long-term site-specific management plan, because you need fertile and biologically active soil. And you also need to think about getting the productivity that you need, and while at the same time building the long-term soil quality. So those are things that growers that grow in the soil, in the open field, and sometimes under hoop houses or low tunnels have to think about. And when we're talking about the soil, we usually cover the physical properties, the chemical properties, and the biological properties, because all of them are very important to understand where your soil is when you're starting, and then where you would like to go. Most of the time, when you're dealing with soils in Arizona, you can deal with some of these challenges, such as a high pH, where it may be difficult for the plants to take up enough nutrients. You may have caliche, which is a water and air impenetrable layer under the ground. A lot of the Arizona soils have low nitrogen content and also low organic content. And especially for growing vegetables in the ground, or for growing even some of the other crops, having a higher organic content is very important for sustained plant soil fertility, and then for the plant health. Also in our climate, because of the heat and you have to constantly add irrigation, there is a rapid decomposition of organic material. So you have to add that continuously throughout the growing process. And another thing that is very important when you're maybe after you take some of the classes, you say, yes, I'm ready and I will be producing crop XYZ in the soil. Make sure when you're looking for properties that you will work on, that you understand the quality of your soil, those chemical and physical characteristics, and also the water quality and how much water is available, because water quality and availability along with the soil quality are very important to set you up for success. And if there's anything in any of the parameters that would say, well, this water is not suitable to produce most of the vegetables, and this is what you're planning to do, then you should definitely go to another site. Similarly, if you find, well, I only have so much of a flow rate of the well or the water that can be allocated for my plot, so I can only grow drought tolerant plants. If you're planning to grow a vegetable, that drought tolerant water allotment will not really get you to grow the vegetables, except maybe on a very small piece of land, instead of, let's say, the entire area that you had planned to cultivate. So when you're looking at organic production, cover crops are usually one of the things that a lot of growers are using to improve long-term the fertility and the physical and the chemical properties of the soil, because the cover crops are used in between the cash crops. So they are used, let's say, in between growing vegetables or growing herbs or some of the other crops that you may be cultivating. And examples can be like sorghum, Sudan grass, sun hemp. I have a few other examples that are typical here in Arizona. For example, you can grow alfalfa as a cover crop, but not sell it, but plow it under so that it actually enriches the soil with that biomass of the roots and the shoots, and particularly alfalfa being a nitrogen fixing crop. Also, you're getting this free enrichment in fertilizer. So cover crops prevent erosion, they add organic matter, they fix the nitrogen, and they can take up surplus nitrogen and suppress the weeds. Cover crop benefits also are that they help in moisture retention and infiltration of the water, and they improve the nutrient holding capacity. Cover crops have also been shown to be very beneficial in increasing the microbial populations and diversity, and can assist in the suppression of weeds, insects, and diseases. So overall, cover crops are a very good tool to improve soil health and resilience. But there are some challenges as well. Which crop is best for you? How much does this cost you? And how much water do you need to establish the crop? And do you need to manage weeds in there? You have to know when to terminate the cover crop, because otherwise you can end up with some unmanageable above ground material that will be very hard to till in if you don't terminate it fast enough. And also if you allow the crop to set seeds, it may then disrupt the crop that you want to grow. And some of the cover crops may attract disease organisms. So there are a couple of things to consider. And then when you're choosing your cover crop, you have to be clear on what's the goal for the cover crop, and which ones may be best matched for your soil type. How does it work? Which cover crop works best with the cash crop that you want to then produce and sell? And do you maybe harvest the cover crop a couple of times and then plow it under and use it to enrich your organic material? But understanding that there are irrigation and fertilization needs for these cover crops is important. And of course, while you're growing that crop, you're not growing something that you can sell. So the cover crops, they help you with, they essentially can be looked at as a slow release fertilizer when they're going into the soil. But depending on the crop that you have, it will vary how much nutrients they can actually release. So there are several publications that are available where people have made lists of annual, perennial, cold season, and warm season crops, single or mixed cover crops that can be planted and that are suitable for the lower elevation here in Arizona. So another area that I wanted to briefly touch on, because I was told that a lot of people are interested in growing in some kind of controlled environment. So maybe greenhouse, maybe hoop house. So the question is, what are growing structures most often used for? Do you use it for propagation, which is very common when you're growing plants from seed or from cuttings in the early stages of production? Or do you want your structures to grow all the way to the end, or do you want to have a structure where you grow something all the way to the end and you're selling a plant, or maybe you're selling the fruit, or sometimes even the seed of a crop? And you need to think about what are the crop needs and how much money do you need to purchase a greenhouse, a shade house, a screen house, a hoop house, or high tunnels. And then as it goes down to the cold frame, these are smaller units then, and they are less expensive. Germination rooms are usually very specific to large nurseries that grow a large amount of seedlings, and indoor farms are something altogether different, where you're using sometimes even containers that are insulated and then outfitted with the type of growing structure you need. When you're growing in controlled environment, you need to learn about the glazing material. So that's the material that the frame is covered, and that can be glass or plastic or a lot of different types of woven cloth, shade cloth. You need to learn about heating, cooling, irrigation, and of course the environmental control. The types of greenhouses here are some. On the left, you can see a greenhouse that is where the roof has been opened, but it can be closed too. On the right, you see a permanent shade structure that some ornamental plants are grown under. And then here we have some hoop houses. On the right, the glazing is plastic, polyethylene, and on the left, it is a shade fabric. And so going from the greenhouses to the shade houses, you have less and less control of the environment. But in a hoop house, for example, you can raise the sides and then you can vent the structure. Whereas in a greenhouse, you would do this usually by a computer controlled system. But the hoop houses in the wintertime, in colder areas, they can be really helpful to grow produce that is well protected and not subject to rain or excessive or potentially hail or things like that. And it can extend your season in early spring and late fall. Of course, in Arizona, we have a lot of sun, so we need often shade protection. And you can see here, it can be inside a greenhouse, or it can be outside, or in some cases it can be sprayed on, or in some cases, like on the bottom right, it can be put over the glazing on a hoop house. And then here are a couple more examples of the screen houses. Those would protect the plants from incoming insects. And then the smaller cold frames, and then an indoor farm on the right, where everything is controlled and no outside light enters. What cultivars do you grow? You have to look at when you're growing kale. We tried a couple of different kale cultivars, and we found that some are doing very well. But then in 2014, you can see our marketable yield was very low because we had a lot of insects very early in the season. And so it's important to keep good records and understand your environment and which cultivars can withstand some of the environmental conditions you may encounter. You can also have covers within a structure. You can see that over here where you have like the low tunnels on the left side, and then you essentially have structures to cover the tomato in wintertime in a place where it gets to freezing during the nighttime. And then you need to learn about the environment to understand how covering some of your crops will really increase the temperature in the structure. And here's an example of lettuce where the optimum growth range, the temperature would be between 55 and 75. But you can see that all the coverings, the curves that are above that upper line of 75, the temperatures for several hours of the day will go into the hundreds, which is really detrimental for the crop over here. So what are you going to grow, which crop, and how will you grow it? Before you get into the production, you need to think about your production system, what startup capital is required, how much land do you need, what quality of soil or water you need, what infrastructure do you need, buildings, are you going to start large and will you have employees right away, who is doing the marketing, because you don't want to grow a crop before you know where you will sell it. And then most importantly, for you being the person starting this business, what part of this business is most interesting to you? What will be your responsibility? And will you enjoy this 7 days a week? Because most of the crops, especially the smaller your root zone, the more attention you have to be able to pay to it daily in order to prevent any kind of disasters. And so as parting thoughts, I just wanted to also let you know about some of the niche markets. So we have microgreens, fruits and vegetables that are that can be profitable, can be grown inside or outside structures. You can grow transplants like on the bottom left, or you can grow specialty niche crops like lavender. You can maybe have honeybees on your operation as well that can help with pollination, and you may be able to harvest honey. Cut or dried flowers can be profitable. And then also agritourism, you know, you pick places, and some of the you pick places, like right now for the pumpkins, they have all kinds of other attractions, and they charge people entry fees in order to cover some of their production costs. Some people have specialty tasting tours where they charge people $20 to come and try different cultivars of, I don't know, peaches or apples or some other fruit that they're growing, and they teach the people about it. But this can be a valuable supplemental income. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for some questions.